Welcome, welcome, welcome. I hope that your day, morning, evening, or whatever time you are listening to this, you are doing well and ready to learn about freedom during slavery. This is a two-part series developed by Dr. Beau Gaitors for Children of God Church here in Knoxville, Tennessee, in the month of February, Black History Month. 2023, that deals with one of the aspects that tends to be overlooked when we look at the history of African descendants, that of freedom of African descendants. More specifically, we have a heavy focus on slavery, but this will really get us to thinking about how complex that time period was and the fact that not all African descendants were enslaved and not all African descendants did the same thing during that period. So I hope that you're ready to take this journey, to venture into this exploration, and to engage this particular topic where we jump from what happened for the forced migration of enslaved Africans, the complexities on the ground and the type of labor that they conducted, as well as using New Orleans as a case study to think about the ways that freedom operated throughout the Americas. When we talk about the transatlantic slave trade or the history of the forced migration of enslaved Africans to the Americas, in the United States, we have a tendency to only focus on the United States. But I want you to take a moment and look at this map. It gives us an opportunity to reflect on the large numbers of enslaved individuals that were not only taken to the United States, but really an opportunity to see how the vast majority of enslaved individuals were taken to other places throughout the Americas. They were taken to Mexico, for example, between 1520 and 1620, roughly 100,000 people were taken there. Brazil boasts more than 5 million people. You can reflect on these numbers as you think about the large numbers that were taken to the Caribbean islands, Haiti, Jamaica, Cuba. There's so many people that were taken to these spaces in order to participate in the labor regimes in these spaces. For those of you who will travel to continental Africa, and I'm hoping that is all of you who are listening will take an opportunity to travel there, you will see along the coast in different places, whether we're talking about Senegal or Ghana, factories or more commonly known as forts that were used in the trade of enslaved individuals. These forts were built by the Portuguese in the late 1400s and early 1500s, initially developed in order to store goods that they traded with African kingdoms and empires. As conflicts took place in continental Africa, these forts were also then used to house captured Africans who had been, in some cases, taken as prisoners of war. Now, this is a much more detailed conversation, but I'm going to leave it at that in terms of the conflicts. But just as in Europe, there were conflicts between different nations and empires, the same thing took place, or similar things took place in continental Africa, which led to prisoners of war being taken and captured. Now, these forts that housed enslaved Africans or prisoners of war at times, and also enslaved individuals, they were controlled by middlemen in the slave trade, and these forts were known as the last point of departure before enslaved Africans boarded ships to be taken across the Atlantic. Throughout this presentation, I want to make sure that we stress and understand the fact that enslaved Africans were not just passive beings during their period of enslavement. In fact, On ships before they even arrived to the Americas, there were several revolts and rebellions that took place. Countless. One of the rebellions that we know much about is the Amistad Rebellion. For those of you who are listening who either heard of or actually seen the movie, it gives us a way to understand how enslaved Africans were in some ways separated by language, but also how they came together to resist enslavement from the very beginning on these ships. The Amistad Rebellion took place on a ship that was headed to Cuba, again, thinking about the role of other spaces where enslavement took place. However, when this revolt took place, the ship ended up landing in the US. These enslaved individuals faced trial in the US, and eventually they were returned to Africa, roughly along the region of Sierra Leone. I suggest for those who are really interested in this particular aspect to search for the movie Amistad, because it gives a lot of the complexities that took place within this revolt. And also do some reading and search for some of the books that relate to this particular event. While revolts took place on some ships, the majority of ships landed in the Americas, and they brought enslaved African descendants to assume, as I mentioned before, the labor requirements that were needed in these spaces. This led to large populations of African descendants throughout the Americas, especially in the early 1600s. For example, Mexico City had a population of 80,000 people according to one census. And as you can see from the number, the vast majority were African descendants, titled negros or mulattos. And a similar situation took place in Peru. This could be seen in other urban spaces as they were built up for Spanish colonial control. But as you look at the breakdown for Mexico City, there are Spaniards, African descendants, and indigenous. And as we know, there are relations between these different groups and among these different groups that take place. As such, especially for the Spanish and Portuguese, there became attempts to structure racial classifications in reference to these different groups. This system of classification was known as the Sistema de Castas, and many artists would paint the images of racial breakdowns of different groups within the Americas. More pointedly, what the Spanish did is they measured the relations between African, Spanish, and indigenous, and they created subcategories for those relations. For example, a Spaniard and an African descendant, their child would be listed as a mulatto, or a Spaniard and an indigenous person, their child would be labeled as a mestizo. An African and an indigenous person, their child would be labeled as a lobo or a zambigo or a plethora of terms. But I bring this up so that we can see that although there was an attempt at delineating and separating groups, there were mixtures and relationships between groups. Whereas in the US, there's this implementation of a one drop rule in understanding racial classifications and structures. In Latin America, there are more categories that are put into place. And I want you to take a moment to look at the following slides and see some of the imagery that's depicted when referencing different groups. Here we see the Spaniard and indigenous, or Espanol in India, which creates a mestizo, and you can see the imagery of the picture. Feel free to pause and take some of the imagery in. For the Negro in India or African descendant and indigenous woman, their child comes out as what's called a lobo. And again, you can take a moment to look at what can be seen and what isn't seen. What does the land look like? How are they depicting the location that these individuals would be in to have such a relationship? And in this image, we see the Española and Negro, or the Spanish woman and an African descendant man, which leads to a mulatto child. And again, take a moment to look at what the artist depicts. In the previous image, I asked you to look at the background. In this one, take a look at the clothing. And if you have a moment, go back to the previous image. Think about the clothing that they depict for the African descendant man and different relationships and what that may signify in terms of wealth, access to resources, and access to different people. As I said before, enslaved Africans were brought across to assume labor requirements. While we're focusing on Latin America, I also want you to think about US locations. For example, many enslaved individuals were brought across to work in mining regions. Those mining regions primarily led to the extraction of gold and silver, and many of the enslaved individuals were brought from mining regions in continental Africa. So I want you all to consistently remember that enslaved Africans are not empty vessels just brought over for labor requirements. They have engineering knowledge that they then employ or are forced to use once they are brought to the Americas, especially from regions like the Gold Coast, which is now known as Ghana, and surrounding nations. But not just mining regions, they're brought to plantations. And what are some of the plantations or some types of plantations that you immediately think of in the US? Indeed, cotton, rice in the Carolinas, sugar plantations in Louisiana. Those are the same types of plantations that enslaved Africans are forced to work on throughout Latin America. But we can't forget about urban spaces or cities that enslaved Africans are in. In the US, we have New York, and there's actually a revolt that takes place in New York. You have Baltimore, you have Philadelphia. We can go on and on. Later, New Orleans. We can go on and on with these urban spaces that enslaved Africans are working in as dock workers, as carpenters, as blacksmiths, as tailors, as merchants. They are consistently making these cities run. And just a quick point of plantations, we don't want to forget the tobacco plantations that especially emerge in the US and the Carolinas and in Virginia, but also throughout Latin America, where many of the cigars are made today. Take a moment to look at this image. And what you see are the different ways that individuals worked in mining regions throughout Latin America and in the US. Colombia is a prime example, primarily because there is a large population of African descendants that lives in Colombia, and they live on the land that was used for mining operations in the colonial period. That region is known as the Chocó, a beautiful place that when you all travel to Colombia, I would suggest visiting. But that region, even by the 1780s, had thousands of enslaved Africans who lived there, who extracted gold. Beyond that, it also became a space of refuge because of the mountainous areas that surrounded it and the forested areas that surrounded it. So the Chocó provides us with one example. The next example is Minas Gerais in Brazil. Minas Gerais. Minas Gerais means general mines in Brazil. And in the general mines in Brazil, individuals found a range of rare gems. They were forcefully taken there and forced to extract these gems. But some individuals gained their freedom for finding large gems. Others used the mountainous regions as a space to flee and create settlements. And there were also spaces where some enslaved Africans were able to provide food and clothing in sort of a merchant way in this region. But Minas Gerais also has this fascinating history when we think about mining, the intellect and the level of engineering skills that these enslaved Africans had, as well as the resources that they acquired that were then sent to the colonial powers, whether we're talking about Portugal or Spain or France, and how the resources that they extracted in mining were then used to build up the wealth of these colonial powers. Earlier, I asked us to reflect on the types of plantations that existed. And immediately, at least in the US, one of our initial jumps is to cotton plantations, right? We think about Mississippi and other regions in the South and in the Southeast that had extensive cotton plantations. These same types of plantations existed throughout Latin America, but what I really want us to think about are the sugar plantations that emerged in different spaces that led to massive forced migration of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic into the Americas. The development and production of sugar in the Americas became a foundation for increasing the wealth of colonial powers throughout Europe. Brazil became a leading producer in sugar in the 1500s that led to a massive importation of enslaved Africans to work these sugar plantations. It led to an increase, especially around the regions where sugar was produced. For example, in Salvador da Bahia, or Bahia in Brazil, it became a large sugar producing region. And what we see to this very day is a very large population of African descendants that exist in that region of Brazil. If you take a moment to look at this image, you see that these sugar plantations required the labor of countless individuals to cut the cane, to wrap the cane, and to collect it in order to take it to a sugar mill. Brazil was not the only place to produce massive amounts of sugar. In fact, the amount of wealth that was seen pouring into Portugal had been acknowledged by the French and the Spanish, and they wanted to participate in this endeavor as well as they forced enslaved Africans to resume the labor requirements. Haiti began to dominate sugar with French control. And in fact, there's a point where Haiti is known as what they call the Pearl of the Antilles. It becomes the largest wealth producing colony and it increases the French's wealth significantly. Now, just a little bit of history. Haiti was initially controlled by the Spanish all the way until 1697. And so there's roughly from 1697 to 1791, a little bit under a century of French control and domination of Haiti, where they bring in hundreds of thousands of enslaved Africans. But one point to make clear is that the labor requirements and the conditions on sugar plantations was not conducive for longevity or for continuous lifespans. In fact, there was an extremely short life expectancy of individuals who left ships and made their way to these sugar plantations, which was roughly 3 to 7 years. These numbers come from calculations that other historians have done looking through plantation records and through church records connected with these plantations. Many people would pass away from overexertion, but they also passed away from the spread of disease, such as yellow fever and malaria, that are carried by mosquitoes. And sugar plantations were known to have large pools of standing water, which are grounds for mosquitoes to breed excessively. Yes, sugar plantations are not only relegated to the fields. We also have to think about the multiple layers of processing that took place. For those of you who have not held sugar cane, it is dense, thick, tastes good, but you have to literally crush the cane to get the excretion from that cane in order to boil it and then to process the sugar. So there are multiple steps that took place outside of the cutting of the sugar cane in the fields. They would then have to be transferred to sugar mills where labor was continued in extremely difficult climates with heat excessive within the confines of these rooms. While we have enslaved labor that took place in mining regions and on a range of plantations, there's also enslaved labor that takes place in urban spaces or in cities. We can think about certain cities that needed the labor of enslaved Africans: New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, New Orleans, but also throughout Latin America. Port-au-Prince, Havana, Veracruz, the list goes on. But these spaces require the labor of skilled workers, blacksmiths, carpenters, tailors. And in this space, enslaved Africans could literally rent out their labor. In many instances, they were required to bring a certain portion of money to an enslaver at the end of a day or the end of a week. They also had more freedom of movement throughout the city in order to conduct the labor that was required of them. But this movement throughout the city allowed for the development of networks and the passing of information and news. It also led to individuals being able to save their funds and eventually purchase their freedom. Now, let's pull back for a second. New Orleans. I'm sure you all have thought about it, heard about it, and many of you have visited. So, what comes to mind when you think of New Orleans? Don't worry, I'll give you a second. Some of you may think of the food, right? The music, the warm air. There's so much to think about New Orleans. But it fits directly into the discussion that we're having today about freedom during slavery. And it's connected to everything that I mentioned earlier. New Orleans, an urban space that provided access for individuals to gain freedom. It's surrounded by sugar plantations during the period of enslavement, and it's connected to those regions that produced materials from mines. New Orleans will be our example to deal with freedom during slavery and the legal routes. And beyond that, I know that I've mentioned the French and the Spanish in many ways. New Orleans in itself had been both a French colony and a Spanish colony before it became a part of the US. So, as we explore freedom during slavery, let's get into New Orleans, a space that provides us with a concrete example of some of the things that I've brought up so far. New Orleans was one of the largest markets of enslaved individuals in the US, but also throughout the region of the Americas. However, when we think about the sale of enslaved individuals in urban spaces, in many cases, there's not one central location. In New Orleans, there's a major demand for skilled labor, defensive needs, and there's an increase in the birth of population. As I mentioned before, there's not one central location for the sale of enslaved individuals. Instead, auction blocks were in hotels, in private residences, in public parks, on the decks of ships on the Mississippi. Remember, New Orleans is located right along the Mississippi River, and even inside of some banks. The next time you visit New Orleans, you may be very well walking past some of these spaces where enslaved individuals were auctioned off. By 1849, when New Orleans is a part of the US, there were more than 50 spaces where the sale of enslaved individuals took place. And that's a result of the need for labor within the city to continuously develop it, but also for the massive sugar and cotton plantations that surrounded the city. Throughout the period of control that the French had throughout the Americas in different spaces, they implemented codes, especially for their African descendant populations, known as Black codes or in French, Code Noir. In the West Indies, they implemented them in 1685 and they introduced them to Louisiana in 1724. These laws imposed harsh penalties on enslaved individuals who went against the rules. They were some of the most oppressive codes for enslaved throughout the Americas. And although they granted some legal rights to free African descendants, it also limited their equality in terms of access to wealth. The Spanish also had codes for enslaved individuals, especially in Louisiana. These codes allowed for a range of things. One of the things that they allowed for was a system known as coartación. And this system gave slaves the rights to purchase their freedom for a stipulated sum of money that was agreed upon by an enslaver and controlled by the courts. That meant that, especially in urban spaces, as individuals were able to save a portion of the wages that they collected, they could eventually purchase their own freedom. It allowed enslaved individuals to initiate manumission proceedings on their own behalf, and they would need to just request what was known as a carta de libertad, or a letter of freedom, of potential freedom. And this shows us that the enslaved did not only rely on quote unquote generosity of an enslaver, but there were legal routes and a court system where they could take advantage of it and operate in their own ways. From its founding by the French in 1718, specifically by Bienville in 1718, and its shift to Spanish control from 1763 to 1803 and U.S. control thereafter, there is an increasing population of free African descendants within New Orleans. They emerge as those who purchase their freedom, as those who end up gaining their freedom through an enslaver granting it, as well as those who are born free. One thing to remember is that throughout this period, the child took the status of the mother. And as there was an increasing population of free African descendant women, their children, regardless of the status of the man, would be born free. So by 1805, there's a free population of African descendants that represent roughly 20% of the population of New Orleans. These free African descendants led to the development of significant kinship networks that their families were a part of. They joined different entities and social organizations. They accumulated capital, so they saved money in order to invest it. And many of them also participated in the military and were active in their church organizations. The funding, the money that they accumulated came from their jobs, and they often used this money, as I mentioned, to not only invest in businesses, but also other property. And all of this helped to forge a group identity for these free people of color in New Orleans. As they continue to collect their money and develop and initiate businesses, they participated in a range of enterprises. For example, free black women owned and operated small stores and sold different goods. They worked on plantations, they herded livestock. There are also many people who operated as laborers, as skilled carpenters, masons, and caulkers. And, for example, after the Great Fire of 1788 in New Orleans, many people needed homes and other establishments rebuilt. This increased the finances of many free black masons and carpenters who used their skills in order to help rebuild the city. But African descendants also operated as doctors and healers. For example, James Duran was a former enslaved individual of a doctor. He was born in Philadelphia in 1762, and he learned medical skills from his enslaver, Dr. John Kearsley. Durham purchased this freedom in 1783 for 500 pesos, and in 1788 he was a free African descendant who spoke French, Spanish, and English fluently, and he became a distinguished physician in New Orleans with a large practice among African descendants and whites by the age of 26. He was one of a few black physicians in colonial Louisiana and earned his license as a physician in the United States. All of these examples give us an opportunity to explore the complexities of what freedom looked like for African descendants during a period of enslavement. What was it to be free, surrounded by slavery, and what types of networks emerged? While in part one, we looked at the foundations of slavery in the Americas and a range of legal routes to access freedom, and one key example of what freedom looked like through the space of New Orleans, part two will explore the extra legal routes, or more specifically, the runaways, rebellions, and revolts that took place throughout this period of enslavement that also led to significant free populations throughout the Americas. For more information on this or more in relation to the African descendants throughout the Americas, please feel free to contact Dr. Beau DJ Gaitors at the email listed below. Thank you.